So right now, how many of you can say in your life you have done something that has changed the world, literally changed the world? How many? Can I see a show of hands? Is my hand the only hand up? Well, it shouldn't be. It should be Dr. Mario Molina, one of our speakers tonight, who has literally changed the world. But if you could not raise your hand, don't despair. Our other guest, Dr. Iain Couzin, is doing research that could help inform us how we might influence the decisions of enough people to impact the world in a positive way. It's beginning to sound a bit like a self-help seminar, but it is actually locust swarms and ozone holes. To better explain how these issues can have such far-reaching impact, we are going to hear from both Professor Mario Molina and Iain Couzin. Part of what we like to see in these evenings of conversations with Nobel laureates, and actually I did not mention, but in 1995, Professor Molina shared the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for work on CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and their impact on the ozone level. So if we're looking for a shared area, it would seem like it's biblically epic plagues. Locusts and disappearing environment brought on oftentimes by our own human mistakes. But I'm sure when you started your work, you didn't look at it and saying, here's a problem, I've got to solve it. There must have been a science that brought you, for instance, in studying chlorofluorocarbons. They weren't particularly, there wasn't a harm. It wasn't like cigarette smoking where we're saying this is causing cancer. They were sprayed out of an aerosol can. They were in refrigerants. Right. It was in every car air conditioner, every refrigerator in the home. And people were breathing it, no harmful effects. So why did you think there must be some chemical reaction happening somewhere and we don't know what it is?
Well, what we set out to do together with my colleague Sherry Rowland is to find out what happens to these compounds after they are released, because they were created as miracle chemicals so that they could replace dangerous refrigerants. So these compounds were miraculous. They were fantastic. They were extremely stable. But measurements showed they were beginning to pile up in the atmosphere. So essentially, we decided to find out whether something would happen or not. And because they are so stable, that's why they go all the way up to the stratosphere. And when they decompose, they can destroy part of the stratosphere. Okay, so this was just a logical finding of what are the consequences of human activities. And so you have to look at all the possibilities.
So you made the discovery. We'll get to what happened when you told the world about your discovery in a moment. But Iain, were you attracted to the problem of locusts? Is that what drew you to this, to look at group behavior? Or were you just interested in group behavior and you decided, well, locusts are about the biggest group we can find?
Well, I was interested in generally in group behavior and looking for systems that we didn't understand how and why they grouped. And locusts was very appealing because of this huge impact that they have on the livelihood of so many people on the planet. And in Science magazine in 2004, what really triggered us was a review that said, even after 50 years of experience, fighting locusts is more of an art than a science. And that's very embarrassing as scientists because the individual locust is one of the best studied organisms in neurobiology and behavior. But the last time someone put them together to see how they swarmed was a woman called Peggy Ellis in 1954, who published it in an obscure journal called the Locust Bulletin. And, you know, and since... And
that's a big seller.
Right. And,
Locust Bulletin. Got a subscription.
No, there was really no research going on trying to understand how they swarm. And if we don't understand how they swarm, then there's no hope for us to develop control methods or more effective control methods.
Now, when you think you've made a discovery of what's the dynamic that surprises everyone, because when you say the reason locusts are moving is because they're cannibals, they're eating each other.
It certainly surprised us. It was completely fortuitous.
Are you hesitant to release that information? You double and triple check it because you say this is so different?
Well, I mean, initially I thought I was going insane because I was putting locusts in. I'd have to put, say, 100 locusts in. And then my postdoc, who would take them out 8 hours later at the end of a locust day, would say, Iain, you said you were going to put in 100, but there were only 98. And this happened again and again. He was a sort of passive-aggressive Frenchman, and I became quite scared. And I thought, how are they escaping? They don't have wings, and we've coated the edges with a chemical such they can't climb. And then it was going back to the videos, we realized they were eating each other, which was completely unexpected.
So this is, you are what you eat, if you're a locust.
Absolutely, yeah.
In this one case.
Well, it's the perfectly packaged source of nutrients. It's exactly the right composition of fats and proteins and salts.
In the blood, the percentage of salt
Absolutely.
of a locust is the exact percentage that they most desire.
We have done experiments with Mormon crickets in Utah and Idaho where we put down different salt concentrations, and they will scramble and fight over 0.25 molar salt concentration. They taste it with their feet, and they fight vigorously, and that's exactly the concentration of salt in their blood. So they're finely tuned to a cannibalistic lifestyle.
This may be a new vampire series. I can just see it coming now to the National Geographic Channel. Mark, when you made your discovery, was there any hesitancy to release what you were finding? Because people thought we've got the miracle, as you described it, the miracle chemicals that have made our lives so much more convenient and easy. And by the way, at the time you made this discovery of what chlorofluorocarbons were doing, people had an average of how many aerosol cans in their home? This is how ubiquitous they were at the time.
About 40 or so.
The average American had 40 aerosol cans in their home at the time. We were dependent upon it. So were you hesitant to release this?
There was some hesitancy as a scientist to go and communicate with the media because it was not very well perceived at that time. You had to publish in scientific journals. But with my colleague, I remember saying, if not us, who? And if not now, when? So we made a decision. We had to go out and talk to not just to the media, but to decision makers. And it was not very well seen by the entire community, but I'm glad we did, because we were convinced that the threat was real, and eventually, of course, that came to be.
And at the time you said, and really it was the chlorine in this combination, it wasn't the carbon you were worried about being released.
Right, sure.
The chlorine destroying the ozone layer.
Right.
And then immediately, I'm sure, industry ran up and said, thank you for stopping us before we destroyed the planet.
Well, it's interesting. That's one of the main differences with climate change, because these compounds were manufactured essentially by a small number of large chemical companies, which initially were, of course, very reluctant to do anything about it. And they said, we won't stop unless this makes sense, and it doesn't make sense to us. But they made statements. If the science proves to be correct, we will stop doing that. And they, that's what they did. And of course, it was coupled to these international agreements. But industry, at the end, of course, came along, and they were able to make replacement compounds so that we can still use spray cans, air conditioning, and so on and so forth, but with compounds that do not affect the ozone layer.
In a minute, we'll talk about in this short period of time what the change has been in reaction to scientific information. Now, in part of your study, you didn't just stop with locusts, because we always like to know how it affects us personally, and since we're not living in areas susceptible to locust plagues, I'm sure not all group behavior, not all decisions are made by, I'm worried about the guy, maybe on Wall Street, it's eating those around you,
right.
But that's not our normal behavior in a group dynamic.
Right. Well, one of the really exciting areas of science at the moment is really understanding better the scientific principles of social communication and how decisions are made and how opinions form in populations and how we can, because we, of course, are unfortunately, we're selfish. We think about our own, benefits, and we don't necessarily care as much about others as we should. And so this leads to some problems such as in climate change. How do you manage to sway the opinion of a population such that they can understand the scientific material and that they will forgo, something relatively small, but forgo something on their regarding their personal life for the global good, for the common good. And so this is a really fundamental issue, is to try to understand how and why do opinions form in populations. Individuals that actually will not be biased, will not have a pre-bias in their opinions, can have a very strong influence on the outcome. They encourage consensus to happen, because if you have two vying groups with no intermediaries, it's hard for a consensus to be achieved.
Let me speculate. I find your data fascinating because there are indeed things that can be explained that way, because there are surveys. Okay, so it turns out when you're talking about minorities, the survey showed that it's only about 10-12% of the population, at least a couple of years ago, that were really thinking this is the climate change issue is just all a hoax, that it's the scientists are crazy, and so it's clearly a minority. But they were very powerful, so they were able to influence at least half the population, of course, through the media, because there was a very well-organized campaign and so on.
On the ozone issue, it would not have worked if it had been up to individual initiative to stop using CFCs. You took government involvement, and I assume the same, well, I know the same will have to be with climate change. The problem is too big. You can't just depend on everybody changing their light bulbs and driving a hybrid.
That's right. So voluntary action is important. It won't solve the problem, but it's very important to show people in decision-making positions that they care. And so politicians, of course, respond to what people think. And so that's why it's very important to have these movements, because they do affect politics.
So what I'm getting at is then, what do you see today? We see in this kind of this general sort of ambivalent attitude towards science. What do you see in Princeton, and what do you see at UC San Diego?
I personally, I think with the advent of things like social media, like I love Twitter, and I follow so many scientists, and importantly, scientific journalists. There are so many good journalists out there who are promoting science and helping the public understanding of science, and they're doing it, through blogs, through Twitter, and so on. I think there's a huge community here. There's a huge interest in science, and so with these types of media, I'm very hopeful that we can reach people who perhaps, their parents or their families inhibit them from learning about scientific methods, and the scientific method is critical. There's thinking in a critical way about the world, not just believing stuff because you're told that's how it is.
And are you seeing the same?
Yes, but let me put it this way. When we have cocktail social meetings, a common opinion is chemistry in high school. Wow, did I hate that? It was horrible, and I had to memorize things.
I really hated it.
See? Well,
I had to repeat it, actually.
I think that's a reflection
so badly.
It's a reflection of how poor we are with education, but there's something going on, a revolution in education, new pedagogy. So starting with K through 12, science is becoming much more interesting for kids because you have now new techniques where they do experiments. They work with each other in teams and so on. Of course, not everybody is doing that, but this is something that the National Academies put together, and it's having an enormous success all the way to college. In college, instead of just sitting and listening to a professor talk about that you can just do on your own, reading a text, but you do active learning. You again work in groups, and you do experiments yourself. So that's a revolution in teaching, and I think science it's already happening. You can measure that with the kids. It's much more attractive that way than just memorizing or having to pass tests.
So there is hope that people will start accepting
Sure.
What the scientists are saying is happening on the planet or in any other part of our lives.
If they can
we'll look at
understand
facts,
science,
and we will analyze them and say, yeah, that.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that people would believe that. I don't know how they actually climb on airplanes. It's all based on science. Otherwise, why don't they crash?
We want to let you join the conversation. If you have some questions, we can, yeah, right here.
Dr. Couzin, I'm curious if you've been approached to or thinking along the lines of how to use your work to, say, draw bigger crowds in a shopping mall to a particular store, or kind of commercial applications like that.
Well, it turns out, I would have no interest whatsoever in pursuing that sort of work. But it turns out that, people used to believe, Stanley Milgram, a famous psychologist, sort of had a study that suggested that there's sort of crystallization of behavior in crowds. There's this strong nonlinearities and tipping points within crowd behaviors such as looking at in shops and so forth. We've replicated those studies and tracked over 11,000 pedestrians and manipulated pedestrian behavior. Unfortunately for us, our work is also consistent with his, but he had a single data point, whereas we collected much more data to look at error distributions. And what we find is that people are sufficiently sensitive to others to gain information from them, but not so sensitive that they'll blindly sort of copy and so I'm thankful about that, because otherwise I think it would be a bit scary how much we could manipulate people's gaze distributions.
Okay. Yeah, right here.
I'm getting the sense that it's easier to make an analogy between human behavior and other kinds of life if the humans have good information about the decision of what to do. But in political life, where you were talking about, the media tends to distort that decision in a way that I don't see happening anywhere else in nature. So is there really that kind of factor going on somewhere that you can begin to get some sense of how those political decisions will be made based on something that happens like that in nature?
In studies by my colleague Matt Salganik at Princeton, actually he did them when he was at Columbia University prior to that, they allowed people to log into a website where you have songs, and this is unsigned bands, so no one's heard these songs before. And unbeknown to you, when you log in, you're placed in one of 8 different worlds with thousands of other people. And in some of these worlds, you don't get any social information about what others thought of the songs. You just have your own view, and you rate the songs. And in those worlds, there was strong correlation between the songs that were considered good, the songs that were considered average, and those that were bad. However, in worlds where you do have social information, where you see how many times the song had been downloaded, and thus get a sense of how popular it is, you get massive cumulative advantage, sometimes called the Justin Timberlake effect, where someone very average can really reach the top or the bottom of the chart due to this cumulative advantage. And so one way that I like to think about this is we've evolved to have a relatively slow rate of communication, verbal, song, and so forth. And when you have social media or technology, this produces a very high rate of information flow. And what we know from studies of animals and humans is that when you have fast positive feedback, this type of cumulative advantage, then decisions become less accurate. And so you get these sort of herd type dynamics where you get this cascades of failure, for example. And so it's not necessarily clear or true that more information or faster information is necessarily a good thing. And in relation to the media, perhaps you'd have further insight.
Well, the comment about media, it certainly has played a crucial role in these issues that we're discussing. But in contrast, we in the scientific community, we haven't done very well. We scientists normally are not trained in terms of how to communicate. So normally we just talk science and people normally get bored. So we have done a very poor job in explaining in simple terms the essential features of the problem that we have. So in part it's our fault, if you want. But the media, I think, should help because they could get informed, better informed. And that's happening already, but rather slowly.
We have time for one more question down here where she's been raising her hand.
In the various animal experiments, there's always a leader or leaders of the pack. Is there any characteristic that determines the physical or whatever characteristics that's going to make the leader? And if I take the leader and I take them out from the head of the pack, what happens to the pack?
So it's a really good question. I mean, not in all groups. If you think of the locusts, there's no leaders in those locust swarms. Within fish schools or bird flocks or ungulate herds, there may or may not be leaders, but we have good reason to think that because individuals, because the world is changing and the world is dynamic, because individuals age and gain experience, that there can often be leaders. So for example, in caribou migrations, there's actually a policy to let the leaders pass for half a day before you hunt. And this actually comes from the elders. This is cultural knowledge. There hasn't been a scientific study, but it's highly consistent with our simulations where we evolve migrations. And we find that in our evolved populations, we expect to have a small proportion of leaders and a larger proportion of followers. And this means migrations can be very susceptible to damage. And again, unfortunately, the scientific evidence is not yet accumulated, but there is anecdotal evidence that, for example, in herring fishing, 1 year they disproportionately took large individuals, not deliberately, but just by chance, disproportionately took large individuals, and that completely stopped the migration. The migration didn't happen that year, and then when it started happening again, it went to a different location. And so there is this evidence that there is this transmission of information, and so in certain groups, this can be like matriarchs in elephant groups, or in other groups, it may be dominant individuals that play a role. And in many of the groups we look at, it's informational status. Leadership is transferable dynamically, depending on who has information about what. And we could do experiments where no individual knows the solution to a problem, but by grouping together, they can solve that problem. And so they can sort of effectively combine information.
Sure. If I can make a comment on leaders in human society, they're of course extremely important, and you can see that historically, but how do they function in a democracy? You would say, okay, they do what the majority wants. No, I think leaders go beyond that. They convince the population that there's a better way to do things and so on. But it's absolutely crucial to elect leaders and not just to elect people that will do what the majority thinks. Anyhow, that's perhaps pure politics.
And to go back on a positive note, the change that Professor Molina made with the CFC studies and getting the ban on chlorofluorocarbons, the ozone layer, which had a hole in it, is healing itself. Sure. And in a relatively short period of time. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you've done study of migration patterns. When migrations get interrupted, they don't resume quickly.
Yeah, you can actually lose them. There can be a strong historical dependence, whereby if you lose that information in the population, even if you recover the habitat, you will not recover the migration. So we have to be very careful.
And on the global scale, with climate change, if indeed these projections prove true, it will not turn around that fast. As the ozone, it won't turn around as fast as the ozone.
No.
If temperature goes up 4 degrees Celsius and sea levels rise, we won't be able to correct our mistake within 10 years.
Right. Well, first of all, let me clarify with the stratospheric problem. The problem is essentially solved, but the compounds remain for many decades there. So that's why the ozone layer it hasn't healed yet, but it's improving, so it will take another couple of decades. But we knew that a long time ago. But with climate change, it's even worse, because we know carbon dioxide, about half is removed very fast. But the remaining, some of that remains in the atmosphere for more than 1,000 years. So that's a big problem that we have. That's why we want to stop it, because we're committing humanity for many, many years, unless, of course, we can extract it out of the atmosphere eventually. But that's a big worry. It takes a long time.
And the bottom line, Iain, you better hurry up and find out how to motivate people. We don't have much time.
I'll work hard on that.
Yeah. And hopefully it's not by devouring each other as a locust. Thank you for joining us. It's a most interesting evening whenever we get National Geographic explorers and Nobel laureates together, and I think tonight was that. And we all learned something, and we learned we better get our act together. Thank you.